Hi, podcast listeners. It's Marie Tepman here, and I have a confession to make. That is that I'm a nerd. Now, before you roll your eyes at that comment, I think you should know how I found today's podcast guest. I was actually reading published papers on marketing science, as in the peer-reviewed academic journal called Marketing Science, and I stumbled upon one of the papers that she co-wrote. Our guest today is Aurelie Lemmens, and she is not just an expert in customer analytics, but she is in fact the academic director of the expert practice in customer analytics at the Erasmus Center for Data Analytics in the Netherlands. That was a mouthful. But before we play the interview, I'd like to remind everyone that this podcast is brought to you by 4.5 Marketing Agency. We have been helping property managers with owner marketing since 2012, from strategy all the way to implementation. Visit 4andhalf.com to learn more. That's FOURANDHALF.com. Part of why I'm so excited about this is you are an expert in the topic of customer churn, and you've literally written peer-reviewed papers about this. Now, for our audience members, property managers, can you give us a bit of a background on what's this concept of customer analytics and the kinds of research that you and your group are doing under that umbrella?
Yes, that's a very good question. So you can have many definitions of what customer analytics is because it's very broad, right? But if I would have to pick one, I would say, so the idea of customer analytics is basically try to leverage as much data as possible that you have about your customers, and they can go from various stages of the customer journey, right? Going from customer acquisition, or even before that, when the customer is visiting the company website or visiting your store, if you have a store, when he's signing a rental contract, in the case of the rental context, when he's filing complaint, for example, when he's calling the customer care center, when he's responding positively or negatively to a marketing action, all the way to the moment that the customer will say, look, no, I'm canceling my contract and I'm going to do what we call churn, right? He's going to leave the company. So you're going to basically try to leverage all this data with more or less sophisticated analytics in order to be able to do one thing, and that's to decide what's the best marketing action for customers at a given point in time, because it can change at different moments, of course. So ideally, you want to find out what's the optimal action for this particular customer at a given point in time. And that's what we try to do, basically.
Yeah, it sounds very like technical, right? And kind of highfalutin whenever there's the mention of analytics or data. And so, the paper that I read that you co-wrote was all about, customer churn and maximizing profits using kind of churn analytics. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what that study was about for the benefit of our listeners?
Yeah, I think that there are two, if I have to summarize, there are two main points that you need to understand. First one is the notion of what we call incremental lift. Basically, that's very simple. What you want to know is what is going to be the impact of my intervention as a marketer on the customer behavior. And by impact, I really mean what's going to happen with the customers that would not have happened if you would not have perform this action, right? And that sounds very easy. Of course, it's a little bit complicated because you never observe both situations, right? Either you choose to do something or you don't do something, or you do A and you don't do B, right? So but there are methods that allow you to actually see what's the impact of doing something. And that's the first thing. So this notion of incremental impact. And then the second notion that's actually very central to the paper is the fact that all the customers are different from each other. So we call it celebrate heterogeneity. So, right, we want to recognize that every customer is different. And basically, once you know how they differ from each other, you can actually start going, like I said before, you can start designing an action that would be different for customer A than for customer B. So that's basically the two things that we cover in that paper.
Yeah, that's amazing. And another takeaway that I had from the paper was the commentary on how most companies, when thinking about churn, focus on doing something about identifying the people who are most likely to churn, kind of as a first step, and then trying to figure out what to do to keep those people from leaving. However, the paper was very clear that this may not be the most logical thing to do. Can you give us a bit more intel on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's very natural. So if you know, and it's coming probably from, the problem is probably coming from the data you have about the customers, but also from simple heuristics that you might have in your mind. So it would be very tempting to say, you know, we know which customer is leaving the company, and we can characterize them in terms of, you know, are they more males, females, where do they live, how long have they been with the company? And then once we know these relationships, then we can say, look, let's focus on the customers who are leaving and try to retain them. And that makes a lot of sense, right? So when we have this data, we can do that. But the problem, of course, with this strategy is that you might then try to retain the customers that have the highest likelihood of leaving the company. And these might actually be the customers that are the hardest to retain because maybe they already made up their mind, right? So it's a kind of a dance with the customers where you need to try to find out, maybe not the customer with the highest probability to leave will not be the best target, but those who have a very low probability to leave, maybe also not, because those customers maybe are happy and will stay with the company. So it's more like the customers in the middle, right? Those where you say, okay, they might be leaving, but there's also some possibility for us to intervene as a firm. So what you need to do there is to try to predict what will be the responsiveness of a given customers to your intervention, right? Maybe some customers will respond more positively than others, and that's what we want to figure out.
Yeah, so basically, right, focusing on people who are kind of on the fence, because people who are most likely to leave may have already made up their mind, so maybe it's a waste of resources to try to save them. And then on the other spectrum, people who are least likely to leave are going to stay regardless of what you do, so why kind of spend extra on them? So it's the people in the middle. And so it's kind of like a bell curve, right?
Something like that, yeah. And then from the research I've been doing, but of course it's very much context specific, so we cannot generalize those insights. But actually found out for half of the customer base, you actually have a negative impact if you target them. So actually, there's only the first half, and we need to see who these customers are. So that really depends on the context. But basically, there is a whole half of the customer base that doesn't react positively if you target them. And it can either be that, you know, that maybe they really don't like the fact that you do something, but it could also just be that they react positively, but simply the cost of contacting them and what you offer them is going to be greater than the benefits of doing so, right? So if you give them a discount or you send them a gift, maybe this gift is actually more expensive than the benefits that you will get from doing so. So that's also something, of course, that comes into the equation and the cost of the intervention.
Yeah, and does that go into the sleeping dog portion of the paper that you mentioned, where it might be easier for people, the cost might be on our side, but it might also be on the people's side, where if you intervene with them, they might even remember that they're unhappy, or you're just bothering them and they don't want to deal with it. Could it be something like that?
Yes, can be something like that, especially if you keep contacting them, right? Suppose that they are really on the top of your priority list, that you say, oh, these are the people who are really going to leave the company. So let's try to contact them and make sure, you know, they stay. Maybe at some point they really get fed up, right? There is this research that shows that the more you contact the customers, the more they will hate you, right? So you should also be careful over there.
So you're almost like shooing them away sometimes.
Yes. There's a lot of industry where there is a lot of inertia. Customers are just, you know, they have a contract, but they even sometimes forget about the fact that they have this contract. So you don't want to make that too salient for them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think at some point can it get so specific that you're making decisions based on the individual client? Do you ever see that, where you can get so granular that you kind of gauge the individual and not group them? Does that happen? Or are you usually able to put them into one of those buckets?
Yeah, usually it's in buckets, right? So in practice, you do have an estimate like per customers, but I think to be realistic, what's more realistic is to just group them into segments and say, okay, these are the customers, maybe my top 10%, and this is what you should do with them, and especially because also your intervention or your marketing action might not be tailored to one specific customer. So maybe what you can consider is to have 2 different marketing actions, one for group A, one for group D, and then you segment your customer base like that. That can also be an option to do that, right?
Yeah. And on the topic of kind of sleeping dogs and how there are some people where if you contact them, either they're more likely to churn because they get annoyed. And then for some other people, yeah, you get to retain them, but the cost of your retention effort, your intervention was more expensive. So you end up on a net loss. But in that sense, right? Like, how do you then figure out like which people are worthy of your intervention without a high risk of the business waking up the sleeping dogs or just losing money on people who are going to stay anyway?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to define what kind of KPI you want to look at, right? Because I was saying, okay, maybe some customers, it's not worth it, but it could also be that it's not worth it in the short run, but maybe by contacting them, you still build more of a long-term relationship with the customers, right? So maybe it could be that the gift of $5 is not going to make a difference in the short run, but maybe in the long run, these customers are going to have a higher customer lifetime value, as we call it, right? So that could be, so that's first one thing, right? We need to define a good KPI for the business. So that's something important. And then second of all, once you know what the KPI is, the easiest thing you can do is to have a small, what we call A/B test or randomized control trial, where you put basically half of your customers randomly chosen. You give them a specific retention intervention, for example. Let's say you're going to send them a thank you email. That would be one option. And then the other group, you don't do anything, you don't contact them. And then then you get the data later on about, for example, what's the customer lifetime value in group 1, in group B, at the individual customer level, and you can start comparing two groups, which allow you to do two things. First of all, to see if on average, sending this thank you email was profitable, was a good idea to do. And then second of all, try to see what are the customers that in each of these groups that actually react best, right? So try to see based on the characteristic of these people, what are the customer traits that make a customer more responsive to this thank you email, for example. That's a little bit how you proceed.
Yeah. And so when a company or a business owner is trying to do something like this, like analyze what subset of customers respond to a number of different kinds of interventions, you mentioned about resources. Like, how does a company decide on a budget for something like this? Like, how did they budget for the tests? I'm imagining the budget for the testing is separate from the actual like campaign once they have the insights. So what does that look like?
Yeah, well, the beauty of this testing is that it will give you an estimation of how much profit you will be able to generate once you decide to roll out the campaign at the customer base level. So based on that, then you can figure out what's the best trade-off for you, right? How much money do I want to spend given the return it's going to bring me? And then it's up to the company to decide how much customers they want to involve. But usually the first experiment, so the A/B test, is on a very small scale, and you don't need a lot of customers in order to be able to find out, okay, what works best, what doesn't work, and for which customer does that actually works. So that's a bit, but also some action that actually very costless, right? So sometimes sending the email, I mean, doesn't need to cost a lot of money, right? Maybe you're going to send the email anyway, it's just that you're not going to change the content of that email. You're going to say something in that email that actually will make the customer react more positively than by not saying that something. So in that case, the cost is even zero. Then if you see the impact is positive, you can roll it out.
Right. So for example, if I'm a property management company and my property owners are up for an annual renewal, they're renewing their agreement, we might not send anything, or we might just send a thank you email, or we might send a thank you email to one group and a thank you email with a gift, a gift link or something like that. Is that a test you would suggest doing? Or would it fall into that category?
Yeah, that would be a very good example.
What would be the smallest sample size? Like, I guess what is the threshold? How small can you go? Because we do have I mean, there are property management companies that have 5,000 clients, and then there are property management companies that have 50 clients. So my understanding is you don't need a huge group, but what is too small?
Yeah, that's if you want me to go technical, that basically depends on what we call your effect size. So just to give you the intuition, basically, if you expect that your email is going to have a huge positive impact on retention, for example, then you don't need a lot of customers in order to be able to if the impact is very small, then you might need a bit more customers in order to be able to figure out what's the effect exactly. So, and it also depends on the variance of this effect, right? Is there a lot of differences between, a lot of heterogeneity between your customers? So these are all things. But of course, if you have a very small company with just 50 customers, maybe the whole idea of A/B testing is not so relevant anymore. Maybe then it's more like you go to the customer, you talk to the customers, and then you figure out there on the spot what's the best strategy. Of course, the idea of customer analytics is usually more often applied to cases where you are not directly in touch with each individual customer of the company.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and so based on your experience, I mean, because you are an expert in customer analytics, not just with customer churn, have you seen any differences in how B2B versus B2C companies should think about customer churn? Because property management is such a unique business in a sense that the kinds of clients that they work with can be a mixed bag of like intentional investors who primarily think of their rental portfolio, their rental properties as like a business enterprise, right? It has to make money. What I put in has to, make sense. And then they tend to view the relationship with a property manager as B2B versus the other type of owner, which is accidental landlord. So maybe they inherited a property. They didn't really set out to build a rental portfolio. They happen to have a house to rent out. And so they may look at the relationship with the property manager more as like a B2C, right? So any insights around the difference of the two?
Yeah, that's a very good point. There are probably a lot of differences. So the first thing I would say is that we should first look at the reason to churn. I believe so. So it could very well be that the reason why a renter is going to churn is going to be very different than the reason why a property owner is going to churn. So first figure out what will be the most likely drivers of churn in those two groups. And then based on that, see what will be then the best way to intervene, right? Like I don't know the industry so well, but I can imagine that in terms of the property owners, it's much more about nurturing the relationship with the property owner, right? Like make sure that he's happy, satisfied, try to involve him maybe into the strategy of the company and maybe encourage him to be part of the strategy, right? So these will be maybe things you could do. While with the individual renters, I don't think that's something they would be interested in, but maybe there, a reason might be more like the price of the rent, these kind of things. And there you might then think about different type of retention intervention for those customers. So I think the what you want to do is going to be quite different in both contexts. And that you can figure out by actually looking at the drivers of churn across different contexts.
What's interesting is you mentioned, like as an example, perhaps, an owner client may want more nurturing in the relationship. Now, most people, when they hear nurture a relationship, their brain goes to, oh, more communication. Who doesn't like communication? But earlier in this interview, you mentioned that, there is kind of communication fatigue where people just get sick of you. And so in your research and your experience, like, is there some kind of threshold where people are only okay being contacted so often, or does the kind of communication matter, the method or the platform?
Yeah, I think it's very much about the quality of the communication, right? So there's maybe one example I can mention in a very different context where we work with a charitable organization. And there, what we do to encourage donors to give money in a fundraising campaign is what we do there is to let the donor decide for which projects we want to give money to, right? What is the causes they want to give, they want to donate money to. And by doing that, you actually give them a sense of agency, we call that. So a sense that they can actually decide how the charity is going to invest their money. So maybe in the rental context, that would be a situation where you can involve the property owners into deciding what would be the strategy of the company, and maybe they feel therefore more engaged into the whole process. And this kind of quality of communication might actually help rather than hurt in terms of retaining the customers with the company. So it's just some guesses, but I guess this is very important to not just send these very annoying emails, but more like very meaningful emails to the customer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I believe the trend that's happening now is to try to find efficiencies, right, in communication. And so what has happened is, more communication means like more times the owner just gets notified of various things.
More touches.
But what you're saying is not all touches are created equal, and you can't just rely on the automated notifications and count that as communication. What you say when you say communication is actually like types of communication that engage with them, right? Rather than this passive, like, hey, this happened, or like, hey, it's Easter, happy Easter. Like, it needs to actually connect with
have
them.
Substance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly. And that might be something different for different customers, right? So some might like some kind of communication, and others other kind of communication. And that's something that you can figure out by experimenting as well, if you have sufficient customers to experiment with. So again, it's about celebrating heterogeneity between your customers.
And so another concept that you brought up earlier in this interview was customer lifetime value. Now, I know that's also part of your expertise. And I'm curious to know, how tightly does customer lifetime value relate to a conversation about churn? And is there enough of a separation that it deserves its own like podcast interview?
So churn is part of the customer lifetime value. So the customer lifetime value is a forward-looking metrics of the future revenues or cash flow that the customer will generate with the company. Okay, so that takes into account two things. First of all, the revenues that they'll bring into the company, but also how long he's going to stay with the company. That's the retention part, right? So basically, that's the combination of those two things. Am I going to stay for 5 years? And if I stay for 5 years, how much money I'm going to bring in during those 5 years? So CLV is the combination of both retention and transactions, basically. And it's to the future, right? So people often make the mistakes of saying, let's look how much a customer has really spent with the company, and that's going to be the customer lifetime value. But that's not very relevant, because what we want to know is how much they will spend in the future. That's much more important.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think that's like what common sense would tell me, that, hey, how do I compute customer lifetime value? Like, well, look at how much they spent in the last how many months or years, and then multiply that by how long I think they're going to stay. But now that you mention it, it's like, that does make sense. Like, how much do I perceive they will spend more, right? That's
what do I have to spend to keep them for that period of time? Yeah, that's really smart.
Yeah, and I think, like, because in your paper you mentioned that focusing on the churn number, which is like, oh, let's just lower the churn KPI, we want a churn rate of this much, is a small part of the story. What's really important, right, is, well, how much money is there going to be on the table after I expend this time and effort to try to lower the churn rate. And so, like, since we're on the topic, like, I'm really curious, like, is it complicated to figure out like how much the customer lifetime value will be, like, in a more realistic sense, versus just basing off of how much they have spent in the past?
Oh, that's as complicated as modeling churn. These are two things that are equally complicated. But the good news is that the past is quite predictive of the future. So you can actually use past information plus some maybe other information about the customers and some marketing action that you're planning to put into action. and that will help you to predict how much customer is worth in the future. So it is possible to do this kind of analysis at the same level as you do it for the churn. And indeed, everything else equal, I rather target the customers who has a higher expected lifetime value than a customer who has a low expected value, right? It's not just about the churn probability or how much you can change the churn probability, but it's also whether this customer is actually going to spend more money or the same amount of money than yeah. Because it could also be that you're going to retain the customers, but then he's going to go to a lower level of revenues. That would also be an issue potentially, right?
Yeah, like a downgrade.
Yeah, downgrade. But maybe it's better than not keeping the customer at all. That depends again on the cost of the action.
And that's all for this episode of the Property Management Show, brought to you by 4.5 Marketing Agency. We have been helping property managers with owner marketing since 2012. Visit 4andhalf.com to learn more. That's FOURANDHALF.com. Hopefully this interview is turning gears in your head, and hopefully it can impact your business for the better. If you are enjoying our podcast, please consider leaving us a rating or review on the listening app of your choice. Thank you, and see you next time.